Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. My name is Mark Reibold, and I'm the host of the podcast. And joining me today are Alex Kirkland, who's a vice president, and Stephen Ross, a senior manager, both working in our physician compensation and financial services team. The topic for today is compensation best practices for physician enterprises. Alex and Stephen, both of who you've heard on the podcast before, are veterans at the physician enterprise and services related to physician practice management world. They have a lot of perspective as it relates specifically to compensation as well. And so Alex and Stephen are talking about best practices that particularly hospitals and health systems can look at as far as implementing compensation models across their physician enterprise, their physician network, whether it's employed or other contract structures, whatever that may be. There's a lot of different ways, obviously, that comp can be structured. And so Alex and Stephen work in that world a lot and have a lot of perspective there and some good recommendations. Alex actually published a white paper on this subject in early 2019. So we'll make sure there's links available to that as a reference resource there. And they'll also be having future materials on this topic as well. So we'll make sure listeners can find those as they come up. So we hope you enjoy this episode. We thank you for listening. As always, we encourage you guys to follow us. You can subscribe on the podcast platforms. You can provide feedback at the Coker website, cokergroup.com, and you can find and listen directly to this episode as well as all of our Coffee with Coker episodes at coffeewithcoker.com. So we encourage you to check us out there, continue to follow us, provide recommendations on future topics for future episodes, which we would love to do. We thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode, and we look forward to speaking with you in future episodes. All right. Well, welcome back to the podcast, Stephen and Alex. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. And today we're talking again about compensation. Of course, I guess our listeners will have recognize a theme when it comes to some of our topics. At Coker, we do a lot of work on various things related to physician compensation. And as we said in the intro, what we're talking about today is compensation best practices for physician enterprises. And Stephen and Alex have written a white paper. It's available on the Coker Group website at cokergroup.com. And we're kind of running through. We'll be following that white paper a little bit here, but there's been a lot of activity as it relates to compensation, working with hospitals on designing and working through kind of strategic planning and design of compensation plans for their physician enterprise. Typically, you're talking about an employed physician network. It can also relate to other physician arrangements, but I think a lot of what we're talking about here is an employed physician model and some of the best practices as it relates to compensation and some of the processes as far as going in and developing or even revising one of those. And then, kind of how to manage them and maintenance and all of that good stuff. So I guess we'll jump right in. And I think it'd be helpful as we kick off the discussion to talk a little bit first about some of the alignment trends that we've seen out there, specifically alignment, physician groups, independent physicians, and hospitals. And this isn't a new trend by any means. Coker, we've been doing these deals with hospitals on both the hospital side and the physician side for really over 10 years now, as far as kind of the model that's the current wave of consolidation, if you will. But maybe I'll just throw it out to you guys and y'all can kind of briefly bring us up to speed. Where are we today as it relates to hospital physician alignment and integration?
Well, Mark, you said it. It's not a new trend. We've been seeing more and more doctors or physicians move towards employed arrangements and outside of moving away from private practice. But at least according to and there's a number of stats kept on this, but according to the American Medical Association, 2017's data study was the first time that we actually saw more physicians in an employed arrangement rather than those practicing in their own private practice. We have officially tipped the scale, seeing more in the employed setting today.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's extremely important point. I think it's perhaps surprised a lot of people when that data point came out, but by the same token, it probably shouldn't be that surprising.
Yeah, and I'd just add that, given the current healthcare reform environment, the focus on population health, on outcomes, coordination of care, and, with ACOs, CINs, and that type of thing, we don't anticipate that this trend will slow down. It may not be as fast as it has been over the past 10 years or as accelerated, but it will be a steady move, as younger doctors will come out, maybe be a little more risk adverse and want to really partner within, a health system providing care for patient populations.
Yeah. Well, and as we know, again, probably no surprise that one of the big drivers behind these alignment trends, behind this consolidation, is economics, and whether it's restoring lost income from decreases and reimbursement rates for some specialties, whether it's just changes in local market dynamics, whether it's hospitals going through and trying to shore up market share, or if it's kind of a succession strategy where there's a desire for stabilized income going into kind of the latter years of a career. There's a lot of different scenarios, but I think a lot of things that factor into that. But some of the main ones are reducing some of the risk, taking some of that risk off the table, and stabilizing income. So I think that's where comp comes in, and so I think. Let's talk about when we talk about compensation plan and best practices. I'm sure there are multiple components to this, but what are we ultimately looking at here?
Well, Mark, you hit on a really good, important point I want to circle back to, and that is that the economics are driving a lot of physicians toward this employed setting. And I think the move from volume to value, as we see more activity in ACOs, the Medicare Shared Savings Program, MACRA taking stronger effect, that we're only going to see that continue because our revenue streams are changing, and we need health system support to try to maximize those because they're able to invest in resources needed to do the care coordination that Stephen spoke about. But there's also a sizable technology investment associated to that, capturing the right data, sharing that right data with your appropriate providers in your practice, and reporting that back to CMS or whatever the payer entity is. So I think those are just all reasons why we're seeing this shift towards an employed arrangement. And to tack on to what Stephen said, with younger physicians that may be more risk averse, they just naturally move into this employed setting. It's almost creating this culture of, if you're coming out of residency, this is where you're going. Now that's not always the case, but it seems to be more and more the case of just an expectation of moving into this type of arrangement. What we've tried to highlight, as you were teeing us up for, what are the different compensation components that you should expect to work through within an employed compensation plan. And when I think about compensation, I always think about it from two sides. It's part science and it's part art, right? And the science part is, what's the right amount to put towards a work RVU incentive, or the right percentage to put towards a quality piece. And that's what we've tried to lay out here. But the artful part is all about in implementing that and going through the change management in making these types of compensation components and ingraining that within the culture.
And I'd just add to that, it's just really important as we think through compensation is the compensation alignment between the physician and ultimately the goals and objectives of the health system, so that really there's an integrated and aligned structure. And so, though we may, be addressing certain best practices, we recognize that it's highly, dynamic in terms of what is the right compensation structure for each organization. It might look a little bit different given their environment. Are they in a rural setting? Are they in an academic setting? Perhaps more in a tertiary care setting? What are the dynamics locally? What are the focuses for a specific population? And so, though we'll be addressing key best practices, we do understand that there's flexibility within the whole.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, because the local market, I mean, healthcare is always, or still is, I think it probably always will be a local business, right? And the local market dynamics really dictate, how one is going to approach something like this and what the expectations are or should be. And the reality is there are different scenarios. And I think what's interesting is we've worked literally all over the country on these types of things for a number of years. There's still a lot of hospitals and health systems out there that are new to the alignment, specifically the employment game. There's still health systems out there that are just now really getting involved. They may employ doctors, but in terms of building and growing, managing a true physician enterprise, there many cases, they're still in the early phases of that endeavor. And so, when we talk about the components and looking at this from a perspective of, I'm a health system, and we have to think about a model that, and a strategy behind employment and physician compensation that is meaningful for the participants. It has to be meaningful for the physicians. It has to accomplish those objectives or address those drivers that got them there in the first place that you guys just talked about, but also understand the fact that, no two specialties are the same. Frankly, no two providers are the same. You're dealing with sometimes very, different, scenarios. And so as you think about developing that model, and by the way, it's not just the health system's perspective either, right? If I'm on the other side, if I'm on the physician practice side, and there's still, roughly almost half that are still independent and may want to engage in this process. What do I expect as far as going through this process? What do these models look like? What are the key components that should be there or perhaps could be there? And, what does that process look like?
Yeah, I think the starting point is to understand, the reason why the physicians have moved into this employed arrangement is likely because they're looking for some level of security, and that's best represented as within the base compensation. And so that's the first component that we try to tackle in this white paper, is a mechanism to provide providers a regular stream of income. And there's some different ways of putting forth that base compensation. Typically, the appropriate level is about 75 to 90% of what the prior year's or the projected current year compensation will be. You want it to be somewhat less than what the total compensation will ultimately entail. And there's a couple different ways that you could represent the base compensation. The two most common are through a guarantee, and we see those more for ramp-up physicians or those that are in a rural environment. We're going to guarantee a certain amount. We always try to limit that to shorter term guarantees that can have review periods, and to not go higher than the 75th percentile, or keep guardrails in place so you don't start to get out of line from a fair market value perspective. But then the other and perhaps the more predominant way of administering a base compensation is through a draw. And it's critical to understand this is not the same thing as a guarantee, which is often the perception. This draw is delivering that regular stream of income, but it's only a portion of what the total cash compensation will be to the physicians. No matter what mechanism you deliver the base compensation is, the key is to make sure that the economics of the plan, the incentives of the plan, outweigh what the base compensation will ultimately be. That's how the starting point for a successful comp plan is. You want the incentives to outweigh that base compensation.
And Alex, I assume when you talk about the draw, that's more of a, this is kind of the base cash flow perspective in terms of, a monthly or twice monthly, whatever it may be, amount that they get. But, it's not just multiplied by 12 and that's the total package.
Correct. Yeah. There's going to be incentives within the plan, and there will be regular true ups or reconciliations to what the actual plan is paying. The draw is doing exactly what you said. It's just providing that regular stream of income to the physician, so they have those dollars on an ongoing basis. depending on when the actual incentives are paid out, there's going to be a reconciliation. Did we pay out more than the draw? Did we pay out less? Did we owe you money? You don't want to be in a position where you're trying to recoup dollars from the physician, and so it's better to be conservative on that draw payment, so you don't find yourself in that position.
Sure. And so then I guess if the base is kind of the foundational component, but really incentive is what's driving the model, I guess that ties to production, correct?
That is correct. Within the incentive space, in terms of a productivity incentive, work RVU-based models are most commonly used incentives to promote patient volume, and they typically account for 80 to 90% of projected total cash compensation. A couple key components of the work RVU-based kind of productivity incentive, it recognizes that we haven't quite moved all the way over from volume to value, as is sort of a buzz phrase in the healthcare environment today. And so, fee for service income is still largely important in most professional practices in terms of patients seen, in terms of, services rendered and so forth. Typically, we see 1 to 2 tier work RVU approaches as most common. Within that, work RVU credit is awarded for personally performed services by the physician and not necessarily by an APP or a supporting provider, and then should be modified, adjusted so that there's a very close connection with the resulting revenue for those services. When you think of productivity incentive plans and work RVUs being the main component to sort of drive that, of course, how do you set the tiers? Where should the tiers be set? Or what we'd say is a conversion factor be set, that dollar per work RVU rate. Typically, median percentile of benchmark data is a good starting point, typically within the 40th to 60th percentile range, is where a conversion rate multiplied by work RVU productivity derives total cash compensation within a range of fair market value. However, it's just really important when setting those rates to understand other components of the compensation model. And we'll be talking about some of those other components here, as well as the local economics, by considering, what is the practice investment? In other words, what can we pay and what should we pay are really two questions to assess when setting a conversion rate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you also referred to some of the benchmarks and the survey data that's out there. And we've talked about this on other podcasts. We write about it regularly. And of course, we deal with this all the time, our clients. But, the interpretation and analysis behind that data is critical. And I think Alex even said earlier, it is a combination of art and science. And in terms of applying that, it's not just picking out benchmarks that seem like they make sense, but they truly have to paint a picture that in reality that makes sense.
That's right. And, in terms of benchmark data, we would just add that because of the variable nature of it from year to year, we would recommend considering updates to conversion factors approximately every 2 to 3 years, as opposed to year over year, just because of, the variation within data, maybe specialty, depending on who decides to respond or not. Mm-hmm. Another component that I might add here in terms of productivity incentives is some primary care models that we see are beginning to augment work RVU-based incentives with panel size incentives, but only has a small percentage of compensation at this point. And that's largely trying to sync up that move from volume to value, where population health becomes much more essential. But oftentimes panel would start around 5% of projected total cash compensation, but be set up in a manner so that the impact can be adjusted or balanced between work RVU based and panel as an organization moves forward with their population health strategies.
Yeah, and the other piece that jumped out, or I think you kind of have to clarify, is that the base and the production incentive have to truly jive together, because again, going back to Alex's point on base, is that whether they're on a draw or whatever, productivity data isn't always perfect right away. It seems like we've typically found there's a little bit of lag in terms of understanding that data month to month. So it's not like, yes, you may be able to access that information real time in your EHR or whatever system you're using, but, understanding utilization is different. And then, making adjustments. That has to correlate back to the comp model and, then going to payroll and all that.
Sure.
And so that's a process in and of itself, but they have to work well hand in hand.
And that's a good point. What we typically see and what it would be best practice is to have that kind of draw that Alex referred to and spoke to, and then have any type of work RVU or productivity incentive type settle up either on a quarterly, half year, or annual basis. Mm-hmm. Frequently, best practice being quarterly, so that it really aligns, behavior and incentives with and pay with work being performed, and kind of reinforces in a positive way, the performance. And
of course, volume is variable in some cases, right? The volume during the winter may be different than the volume in the summer, depending on specialty, and there are all kinds of factors that go into that. But so that's the productivity incentive. I know you guys also touched in the white paper on the non-productivity components, but there are also incentives that you try to build into. Maybe speak to those.
Sure. As we're seeing this push from volume to value and having our revenue streams augmented where the payers are influencing quality measures, even on our fee-for-service business, we're seeing more and more of a move towards quality or non-productivity incentives within the compensation plan. The key thing to remember is that likely it's that our revenues are just starting to get augmented in this way. And so that we want to be proportional with the amount of compensation we're designating for this incentive relative to how much of our revenue stream is made up of this quality or non-productivity incentive as well. Because there's a warning sign where groups may try to move too fast. They get altruistic and said, man, we're really going to push quality here. And they set up the compensation plan to do just that. And they'll get what they designed, meaning that they'll see their quality metrics go through the roof, but they'll find themselves in an unenviable economic situation because revenue took a big hit, because you'll find providers spending, a disproportionate amount of time with providers so that they can focus and do all these things to maximize their quality scores, forgetting that we're still in a fee-for-service environment largely. This needs to be, on our mind to that degree. So we like to say that the amount of the incentive earmarked for quality incentives should be somewhat proportional to the revenue dollars that's influenced by that.
Does that mean if I'm the hospital and I'm thinking about paying for quality, I guess my managed care contracts have to somewhat be lined up to where, that is supported, so that, to your point, the revenue can support the payout on that metric. What does that look like? And is that even factor into it?
It's likely that, their contracts are starting to move that way. Now with MACRA, almost everybody's going to have a flavor of that in their contracts in some way, whether they go out and plan for it or not. We like to talk to groups about like a walk, crawl, run, or a crawl, walk, run approach, where you're starting to think about how do we inject some quality metrics into our plan. And it could be that these are, attendance based, and trying to introduce this concept to providers, getting them to choose what their next year quality incentives may look like. So you get to that walk perspective. Now we're incorporating some actual quality metrics, but maybe they're like process based metrics. And when you're starting to get the provider base used to this type of reporting and how it's influencing their compensation, you can move to that run approach where you're now incentivizing on some outcomes measures. This is a progressive thought groups are heading towards, and we'll continue to see some legislation changes in this regard. We've heard some commentary from SEMA Verma already about trying to relax some of the rules so that we can incentivize more of the outcomes-based measures that they're trying to incentivize within the ACO and CIN model, or within the ACO models.
Very interesting. And one of the other things that jumped out to me, Alex, on quality is, I know one of the questions I hear a lot from the provider side is, okay, how are you going to really measure that? And, obviously it has to be something I can control. And that's where I know sometimes the outcomes-based model, at least initially when that first was introduced, it was a little scary because it's like, well, can we really control outcomes? But I think, it seems like we are working through that and defining and understanding that. But just the ability to track and measure some of this in the form of data, is that still a factor or concern?
Absolutely. Groups have to understand what constraints they're dealing with. You may have this idea of, I want to go do this really progressive initiative, and we're going to track and measure and incentivize on it, but the data may not support it. So start with what data can we capture? What degree of confidence do we have in it? We talk to groups about, again, patient satisfaction, meeting attendance, these things to get this initiative off the ground. Once we're doing that, let's look at the MIPS measures that we're currently reporting. How well are we doing at that? What are our scores on these MIPS measures? And then trying to expand that as appropriate. What registries do they have access to? And can they use that to determine what some of the metrics that they may want to track? One of the most important things to keep in mind is you want to have a coordinated strategy when it comes to determining the type of quality metrics or non-productivity metrics that you track. Sometimes it can be easy to think we want to do all of these different things, and we're a multi-specialty group. We're going to track all of these different specialty-specific initiatives, and before you know it, you've got a list that's unmanageable of all of these different metrics. How can you find alignment with some of the payer contracts that you have, with some of the broader initiatives that you're trying to put in place? And then can you put together a strategy that's moving you towards those strategic goals over time?
Gotcha.
One more area I wanted to touch on in the quality area is how you're allocating your quality dollars from what may be that productivity incentive. We want to advise groups not to pay quality on top of an already market rate that may be reflected within your work RVU incentive. Instead, we like to call it this allocation of value, where of a work RVU productivity rate, can we carve dollars out of that we're earmarking towards performance, quality, non-production incentives. When you look at the MGMA survey, their definition is that those per work RVU rates are already at market levels, meaning if you add quality on top of that, you're double paying to a degree. And so that allocation of value, where you split or you take a portion of the work RVU rate and earmark some of it for a performance incentive, whether that be 5% or 10% or whatever you can tolerate within your group relative to your contracts. I think that's an important concept to be aware of.
Yeah, which is a great point. I'm glad you made it because, again, I think it just further adds to the point that each model, every piece has to fit in respects to the others. So each component is relevant to kind of where the overall package ultimately ends up.
And what I really like about that component, Alex, is that, to the extent that you're carving out a small allocation from the productivity, the work RVU productivity incentive rate for quality, is that it really aligns the physician to not only how much am I doing, but what is the outcomes. I'm going to get some compensation for the outcomes or the quality metrics attached to that book of business or that book of work. And I think that's just a strong element to have in a compensation plan as we move through this environment of, focused on fee for service and now greater to outcomes.
Yeah. Good points.
Great point.
So we got base compensation, we got our productivity incentive, we got our quality and our non-productivity incentive. Walk us through some of the other components that you guys talked about in the white paper.
I think another one that should be considered and is frequently brought up is, what do we do with call pay? How should we address compensation for call pay? And, from a starting point, I think it's important to recognize that, as Alex had alluded to, the benchmark data used to evaluate physician compensation is reflective of total cash compensation, which would also include, compensation for call being received in the market. Another way of saying that is, it's W-2 compensation. Mm-hmm. And so when considering call pay, I think that, first and foremost, what we would advise our clients on is understanding, well, what is a base level or a, base level versus excess level of call? And if it's a base level of call, then really questioning, should we be, compensating for that? For instance, in certain specialties, orthopedic surgery is one, they have kind of a universal expectation of call, meaning that, the practically all the orthopedic physicians will provide some level of unassigned call coverage. Mm-hmm. And so, it's reasonable to assume then that, that those type services are included in total cash compensation benchmarks. So with that, kind of established and in mind, for a physician that is at or above median and or a TCC work RVU, for a physician as at or above median, we would typically consider a baseline level of call burden to be assumed as part of that compensation arrangement.
So it's not, that is the kind of baked into the production piece.
Correct. And so, we, in the white paper, we elaborate a little further, but that if a base level, if call is expected when providing a market-based total cash compensation, then call pay should only be in place for excess call. In defining the burden of call duties and correlating it to the proper compensation. And, we typically, call pay would be, addressed at a fair market value rate on an hourly or daily basis, as opposed to any type of other structure.
Yeah. What else?
Another area that we comment on is administrative compensation. The goal of any physician enterprise is to provide care to the community it supports. Oftentimes, that's going to require some administrative oversight to help oversee that, medical directorships, leadership roles, things of that nature. We want to make sure that we only compensate for dedicated administrative responsibilities, not just the administrative functions that take place during office hours or surgical time. Things when you should be in clinic, we want to compensate only for those dedicated administrative responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And to that point, our preferred practice is to see these administrative responsibilities paid out hourly and subject to an annual compensation. That way you can kind of align it to what level of commitment is there. Does this equate to a 0.1, a 0.2 FTE, and keep track of it in that manner. We use benchmarks to help establish what those rates look like and to help keep us within fair market value. But we're going to recommend to any group that you document those hours, and that should be a requirement to substantiate payments. And at a minimum, the provider should have the dedicated responsibilities identified within their employment agreement, possibly even memorialized in a separate agreement. It may not be within their employment agreement, but there should be some form of documentation that states these are the things that we are compensating for.
And Alex, I assume these, or maybe clarify for the listeners, are these admin duties kind of very specific things that have to be done, have to be checked off kind of a list or a process? Or is it kind of, there's a bucket of time, all your excess administrative stuff related to oversight or whatever that may be needs to fall into that bucket or that allotment, if you will?
There should be pretty good guardrails as far as what the initiatives that the medical director or the leadership role is responsible for. And that's what the administrative time should be reserved for.
Gotcha.
And then there needs to be very specific documentation, how that time is being accounted for. What we'd like to see is a monthly basis. Document your time, submit that, as opposed to that bank of hours that you're just kind of almost billing against in a certain sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the other things I know, and Stephen, you alluded to this earlier, and I know one of the other things y'all talk about in the white paper is working with your APPs And how does that factor into my, I'm a physician, I got my compensation model, and we know, and some specialties more so than others, but across the board, those APPs are critical to them being productive and, getting those clinical quality outcomes, et cetera. So how does that work?
That's right, Mark. I think, as we look at APPs, we need to recognize that there are a number of ways that these advanced practice providers can be utilized. Meaning, are they hospital-based? Are they working, maybe on a medical floor and that kind of thing? And so if the oversight, much more akin to in a hospitalist service or infectious disease service or something like that is commonly found, are the APPs, in a surgical type practice where they're really enabling the overseeing physician, the surgeon, to be extra productive in the OR and in other environments, almost teeing up patients, or in a primary care setting? Is it more of an independent type practice model where an APP is largely, independent, yet there's an overseeing physician, or is it much more team-based collaborative care within a unit? And so all those dynamics kind of will, should be considered when thinking through how should we pay our physicians for APP oversight. There are two primary models or methods, I guess, of payment. The first is just a supervisory stipend model, and that's largely a flat rate paid to supervising physicians. And, it's really recommended for specialists if the APPs are providing overall positive economic impact to them. So much more in the surgical specialty or hospital-based. There's also another model that we frequently will help implement and advise on with our clients, but that's a modified work RVU credit model where a small dollar amount per work RVU is paid to the supervising physician subject to a cap based on work RVUs generated by the APPs. Now, it's not tied to profit that the APPs will generate. It's generally $2, $3, sometimes $4 a work RVU, but really recommended for primary care if their APPs see their own patients. Okay. And, the physician's role there is much more on a per chart kind of supervisory basis as opposed to a collaborative team care basis.
Are there challenges when you're looking at historical data and you're trying to decipher? Because in the private practice setting, a lot of what the APP generates in some models is almost fundamentally built into that historical compensation of the physician. So do you have to extrapolate that out, or how does that sometimes work?
Yeah, I think it's just an important concept that most legal counsel will advise health systems on too, and that is, within the Stark governance rules and guidelines, is that, physician payment should be for personally performed services as opposed to, benefiting off of another's. Mm-hmm. And largely in a private practice model, the physicians are responsible and bear the cost for the APPs. In an employed model, the physicians don't have that expense, and therefore it is a little different on how that should be set.
Yeah. Just something to look for when you are going in and slicing and dicing.
That's a good point.
Finally, I know the component of any comp plan is going to be benefits. And I know you guys called out in the white paper specifically, look at things like PTO. How do things like that and, kind of additional components like that factor in?
Yeah, we wanted to provide some guidance on this. I think because we've worked with some groups in recent years that have run into some financial trouble because of it, where they were paying out PTO at the end of every year, allowing physicians to bank that time and then pay it out. And that's something that we advise against. And the reason for that is because the benchmark data for work RVUs already builds in some of that time off expectation. The work RVUs in the benchmark data is predicated on 46 to 48 work weeks a year. And so double payment occurs if paid time out is not taken and accrued. And so then it's paid out later, in addition to the work RVU based payments that they're generating as well.
Which is something I'm sure that always or is coming up more and more as you think about really getting into the weeds of the data, looking at the information historically and trying to extrapolate those little things like that out from the private practice model versus an employed model. And then, last, you guys talked about, Stephen, you actually alluded to this earlier, but, some of the hospital-based physician models, I mean, you got, and I think we're seeing more and more of this, but I assume that includes hospitalists, intensivists, maybe, like you said, I mean, some of the other infectious disease, things like that. Maybe speak to how those factor into some of these scenarios.
Thanks, Mark. If a physician works in a hospital-based environment similar to a hospitalist or intensivist, or maybe in the ER, in that type of thing where their work is largely aligned to a shift, say, instead of work RVUs, meaning that they don't have a lot of control over the volume they're bringing in. It's more station and fill type work, providing required coverage in order to meet the needs of, in a hospital setting. Frequently in those situations, what we'll see is a shift-based rate set tied to, the benchmark data. It could be on an hourly basis and then multiplied by, the number of hours, depending on how the shifts are structured. Also within that, then, alluding back to some of the comments that Alex addressed, is just ensuring that, if a quality component or a performance component is going to be, a part of that, then those shift-based rates are also allocated or adjusted to recognize that.
Yeah.
And those are the important things to consider for hospital-based physicians.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. All right. So we work with clients and we get really into the weeds of the analysis, right? And we can slice and dice data and deliver analytical reports for days, obviously. And that's a critical part here. But, and Alex, I think you said it earlier, I just want to reiterate, there's the analytical component to this, the quantitative component to this. And then there is the, okay, we got to make this thing work, right? And even after the initial plans are developed and the deals are done, okay, now we actually have to make this thing work. So let's just talk about, how that factors into some of the core compensation structures and, dealing with some of these things that go on an ongoing basis as it relates to, all right, we got the model now, let's continue to manage it, grow it, make it more efficient or just, make it work.
Yeah. I think the main point is that too often physicians are finding directive pushed on them. And they don't want to feel like something's being done to them. Instead, they want to be part of the decision-making process. And so we like to pull together working groups, or more formally, we'll see that there is a subcommittee of a medical group board that is pulled together and made up of physicians that also may have administrative support as well, a dyad leader, something of that nature. You can have a consultant that comes in and provides guidance, things to consider during some of these physician compensation committee meetings. But essentially, you're trying to create a compensation committee, a working group that can determine and have some voice in the decision-making process. And so you're trying to get them to, the physicians, to partner with their administrative counterparts to help shape what the shared goals, how we're finding alignment, what we're trying to hold ourselves accountable to. We very much want them as part of that compensation process. And so we see that work best within a physician compensation committee, that working group type mentality, again, that would likely report into a medical group board. And in that medical group board, maybe, a subgroup from that health system level type board.
Yeah, I've said, for years after seeing many of these deals done, it seems like the ones that are most successful are the ones where you have parties coming together and they truly interact and function as partners. And, the hospital works with the group and includes them in the process. And the physicians work in a very partner type model, contributing to the mission of the system itself.
And I think one thing that will really help that, Mark, or that process, one thing that we see more effective organizations have adapted or adopted is more of a charter at the get-go for that compensation committee, which will really define, okay, what are the roles and responsibilities of this committee? What are the duties to provide oversight and reporting if it's going to continue on past an initial compensation plan design process, and become something rather than just a body that makes recommendations. It has some really good oversight and reporting authority to it, to where they can advise that medical group board that Alex spoke about. And so, broadly speaking, a physician compensation committee, what we would recommend would oversee of course, the compensation model development, but also that maintenance and ongoing oversight, making updates to compensation policies along all the points that we just ran through, and others that may come up, as well as advocating for future models, kind of being that forward-thinking vision to see, okay, healthcare is changing. How do we need to adapt what we have, and then really be the flag standard bearers going out to their peers in the medical group network there to discuss that, support it, and as needed, resolve related issues.
Yeah, I think that governance is critical, and I think setting it up functionally on the front end works far better than trying to come back in later and deal with issues or respond when issues come up, and then try to inject a governance model, policy, plan, et cetera, at that point. So that's very helpful. One of the other things that I thought about here was it's kind of outside probably the scope of the white paper you guys did, but all of this has to factor in compliance, right? And I think that's also where, the compensation committee comes in, policies and procedures, things like that. But all of it has to pass muster from a compliance standpoint, which is there to protect everybody. It's there to protect the system. It's there to protect the providers. And so I think that's something important for us to just mention. I don't have to go into detail on it by any means, but, and that's something we've talked about separately, but it's a good segue, because you have to cover it from all bases, and you have to make sure that as you're going through the process of the plan design and development, and you're setting up these governance structures, that you're also incorporating whatever policy standards and guidelines that are in place or required. All right, so that's very helpful. Any final thoughts or anything we didn't get to add that you guys want to make sure we cover?
I would just add, from a compensation governance perspective, Mark, I think you had mentioned, tying back to your comments on compliance and the importance of compliance in every setting, but particularly in physician compensation. One thing that we do see as a function of the compensation committee is really looking at and establishing those compensation compliance policies, as well as, setting, okay, what is the philosophy for the organization? Some of the key areas that this, of course, would address would include ensuring that compensation is adaptable, it's equitable, of course, it's compliant, it's reasonable. But, specifically, should there be a compensation ceiling cap, for which then there would be a fair market value type internal, external review? So, it's important to identify within, the plan is important to have, but also what are the supporting policies from an organizational perspective that really kind of define the philosophical approach to compensation, so that it can be administered in an even-handed and repeatable fashion for all physicians, irrespective of their status or specialty or their place of service.
Yeah, I think that also helps just kind of keeping everyone on the same page, right? I mean, or setting expectations and boundaries.
Yeah, and especially as you get into the larger and larger groups, where you really want to, to the extent possible, not try to do deals by exception, but rather have very clear established policies and procedures and administrative sort of parameters for which compensation is governed.
Absolutely.
Mark, the last thing I wanted to say is that, as we've discussed here, you can see that it can be a very complicated endeavor. There's a lot of compensation components to think through, what makes the best sense for your group, and then how to effectuate that through a governance process. There's just a lot to entail. And when you're dealing with compensation, it has a chance to be a very political event as well. But there's also the chance that it can be a big opportunity to reset expectations. Going through a compensation redesign can be an opportunity to really align the providers, their incentives with strategic goals in place. regardless of where you are in this process, if you're thinking about making a change to compensation, it's really important to have that change agent to help shepherd you through the process. A trusted advisor, like a good consultant, can do that. Number one, it creates some credibility in bringing in an outside third party for this. And then number two, having someone that's gone through this before and again to help effectuate that change, to lend those lessons learned, and to help drive some of this change. It can be really appreciated, and the missing ingredient that's needed to take this over the finish line.
Yeah, these are interesting processes because you have different personalities, you have different objectives sometimes. And I think bringing those together and bringing in some of that kind of not just subject matter expertise from a technical standpoint, but it's not all just data and benchmarks and market surveys, things like that. There truly is a relational component to this process that I think sometimes it makes or breaks these types of arrangements in terms of success. And then ongoing maintenance. It's not just one and done and put it on the shelf and everything's good. I mean, this is going to be an ongoing process. Awesome. Well, guys, I really appreciate you guys' willingness to come and talk about the compensation best practices, but I think this is helpful to dive a little bit deeper or to cover, I guess, some of the high points of the white paper. But the white paper itself will be available with this episode and the show notes is really helpful because it provides a lot of detail behind all these things we talked about. And so I'm glad we got a chance to highlight that. And I know we'll be talking more about this stuff in the future. And I know we get a lot of questions. And of course, there's a lot of activity going on in this particular area. So I know we'll revisit it, but I appreciate it and look forward to talking to you guys on future episodes.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alex. Good to be on.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.